everyone, and welcome to Kroll's Threat Management webinar. The format of today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation with a Q&A at the end. Questions can be sent to the staff in the chat section of the toolbar. If we're unable to get to your question, please feel free to reach out to Matt or email the team at securityriskmanagement@kroll.com. The presenters today will be Matthew Dumpert from Kroll, Vern Abila from Abila Security and Investigations, and Glenn Lipson from a diplomate in forensic psychology. Matthew Dumpert is an associate managing director in Kroll's security risk management practice. Matt leads the threat management, executive protection, travel security, and operational security offerings for Kroll. Vern Abila, president of Abila Security and Investigations, is a highly accomplished security leader with significant experience in developing and the implementation of global security programs with complex challenges in high-risk, high-demand environments. Vern has been a Tier 1 subcontractor for Kroll for almost 25 years, with expertise in risk and threat management, executive and dignitary protection, threat and vulnerability assessments, and investigations. Dr. Glenn Lipson has been a diplomate in forensic psychology for more than 20 years. A leader in the field of workplace safety and the protection of high-risk assets, he is a contributor to the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals Risk Assessment Guide for Evaluating Violence. He holds the distinction of being the first non-educator to be awarded the Doug Bates Award for promoting morale and ethical standards for America's educators. He continues to partner with multiple disciplinary teams in the areas of threat assessment and risk management. Additionally, he has developed tools and trainings for assessing loneliness, the psychology of inevitability, and techniques such as applying suspended disbelief. Matt, Vern, and Dr. Lipson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carson, and thank you all for being with us. Dr. Lipson, Vern, pleasure to see you. Happy to be here with you. And to all those in attendance, really appreciate your time in joining us today. We hope to provide some insight into the threat management process, some insight into what threat management is and why we take it so seriously, and then how we deal with threats as they present and further manifest. And please, I want to highlight what Carson said. If there's any questions, please do put them in the chat function of the webinar, because we'd like to address them as we go rather than waiting until the end. So while we have a structured 45 minutes and then 15 for Q&A, we really would like to answer those questions as they come up organically. And with that being said, what is threat management? What are we talking about? What is it that we've been hearing? Our definition of threat management is a human-based system where threats can come from anywhere, but these are threats emanating from people. These are not cyber threats. These are not threats to your network. These are threats that come from people. Those threats can come from anywhere. We can learn about them through any venue. They can be delivered through email. They can be delivered through spoken word. They can be yelled. They can be, graffiti found. In a harmful termination or in a high risk termination. It can be something that's yelled or uttered. It can be found on social media. It doesn't really matter how we learn of the threat. It's that threat is based and emanating from a human being. In Dr. Lipson's introduction, the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals was mentioned. It's an organization that Vern, myself, and Dr. Lipson are very involved in and active in. And it's a community of people that's studying threats, threat management, and really trying to get out in front of some of these workplace violence and threat manifestation cases. So with that being said, Dr. Lipson, Vern, any opening words you can offer on your notion of threat management, what it means to you?
I'm unmuting. So threat management basically means you're trying to protect people in an organization when people are frightened or they have fear, the very things we document when we have to get restraining orders. So a lot of what we're doing is setting up and assessing what's going on. And we use the word management because we have to determine where someone is in the process or the pathway potentially towards violence. And is this really a pathway towards violence? We look at where to intervene and what information we need to obtain to prevent something, and then how do we secure an environment in order to avoid an event like that taking place.
And it's also, I think we should add to that, it's not just managing the threat of the threat actor. We need to understand how to manage the client and their staff, lawyers, law enforcement along the way as well.
Yeah, Vern, that's a really good point. A lot of the folks that come to us are being directly threatened, and anxiety levels are high. People are frightened, as Dr. Lipson mentioned, and understanding and working through those fears and those anxieties is one of the more complicated aspects of a quote unquote threat management case. Dr. Lipson, were you about to say something?
Yeah, what I was going to say, that when someone is frightened, sometimes they over respond. They misperceive a threat when one isn't there. It could happen with law enforcement. It could happen in the workplace. So we have to work with the whole community in putting things in context, because when they're not put in context, they could escalate, and you could have beliefs taking place that then create self-fulfilling prophecies. You have people going to show other people, or you're going to have other people who are going to hurt someone before they get hurt. And if they aren't legitimately threatened, we have to prevent those types of escalations.
Really good points. And you know, we mentioned the multidisciplinary process. Threat management is a complicated thing. You know, these threats present any number of ways. They can be communicated in any number of ways. The underlying factor is that, you know, the people lodging threats against people, property, or assets are people themselves. And it takes a multidisciplinary team to really understand and address the threats that are being made. If it's a threat of violence, not only do we have to involve, obviously, the security apparatus, but we have to involve the lawyers in the legal team. We have to involve management teams. We have to involve physical security elements. If there's protection elements that have to be surged into the field because people are being threatened, but also to really understand the person who's lodging the threats against us. That multidisciplinary team and process is critically important. You know, Dr. Lipson, you're brought into a lot of engagements where, you know, obviously not only when there's mental health concerns or considerations, but just understanding the human psyche, understanding that the people that are lodging the threats have motivations, they have fears, they have goals and aspirations and families and motivating factors, destabilizing factors. You know, these are people too. So that multidisciplinary team is critically important so we don't have any blind spots. Dr. Lipson, can you talk to that multidisciplinary team and the importance of having all of our equities covered so that we're not pigeonholed in the process?
Yeah, definitely. These days, since so much communication and threats take place on the cyber level, you need people who are competent in monitoring and obtaining that information. You need people who are also competent in terms of what we call target hardening, which is if an institution is at risk or a business, how do you then set that up? That's not something I'm going to do as a forensic clinical psychologist, is deal with that. But I may deal with group dynamics. I may deal with mediation type skills where we get people working towards the same level of goals. I may work with different stakeholder groups and basically try to calm people down, because we're looking at a course that we're trying to deter, a course leading to conflict, potentially someone getting hurt, and sometimes having someone from the outside assist. And remember, you're going to talk about it in a moment, there's a lot of different areas of problems, which could be interpersonal problems that bleed into the workplace. We've had killings that have taken in beauty parlors due to divorces. We've had kids killed in schools due to marital problems. So there are a lot of different issues of interpersonal problems that contribute, and understanding people can help them de-escalate, can end up with coming up with different pathways away from something that's going to lead inevitably to someone getting harmed.
All excellent points. You know, you highlighted the goal of threat management really there. The goal of any threat management engagement or any undertaking by a threat management team is to get somebody to stop threatening, get somebody to stop doing what they're doing that is causing fear, that's causing anxiety. And then once we get that activity to stop, we have more time, we have more room to assess and determine other mitigation and other courses of action. Vern, what have you seen, particularly in the field, when you go to an organization or you go to a group who's being threatened, who's under threat, in those early days of trying to understand what's happening?
I think the goal of threat management is to identify, assess, and then manage. And I think that's an extremely important word there, is management. I think part of what I said at the beginning was to make sure clients understand what threat management is. Oftentimes we don't stop the threat like they want us to, as if we had a magic wand and we make the threat go away. Sometimes management means it could take weeks, it could take months, and it takes a lot of people and a lot of different law enforcement agencies. We've tracked threats all the way to Canada and to different places where we had to bring in additional disciplines to help us stop or redirect a threat. So I think those are the three big ideas: is to identify, assess, and manage, and make sure we manage the client's expectations is a big goal.
Yeah, not only manage client expectations, but also, one of the things that we hope to do with everyone that we talk with is raise awareness, provide some training, some education, some background. We mentioned, the community of professionals that are talking about these things. There's a lot of data that's being studied. There's a lot of cases that are being reviewed. There's a lot of work that's going on to understand, this pathway to violence that Dr. Lipson referenced, to understand what triggering events might set somebody more toward, inclined toward violence than not. There's a lot of work being done to understand these things, and we hope to convey that to all the folks that we deal with on a professional level. The more we can train our people, the more we can train our employees on what to look out for, what to report, and then not only what to look out for and what to report, but then what's going to be done. What's the process? Full transparency is important. We want everybody to understand what the threat management process is, and we're going to get into some of that here today. And that's so that they can have confidence in the system. We want people to know that when you report a threat or a perceived threat that you saw in an email, that you saw on social media, that somebody called you on the phone and threatened you, you understand what's going to happen in the investigation, in the assessment, in the evaluation, and then in the intervention and mitigation. It's really important to have that level of understanding throughout our enterprise, so that all of our employees can be force multipliers. They can report to a team who's trained to deal with threats. They can report what they see, what they sense, what they hear, and then the threat management team takes over. And that's that multidisciplinary team of employees that understands the workplace, that understands the threat environment, and also understands how to better address threats, and knows when to bring in specialties that they might not have organically. That could include, a company like Kroll, an expert like Dr. Lipson, a specialist and an expert like Vern. And that's really the goal, is to raise awareness, raise education and training. And Carson, if we can advance to the next slide. So Dr. Lipson, I'd like to ask you to comment a little bit on an underlying grievance, on why somebody might be lodging a threat, and what that might look like, and what the important things are to do in the immediate onset of a threat.
Well, number one, when someone has a grievance, we have to understand the nature of the grievance. We also have to understand how they see the grievance resolved. If they see the grievance resolved only occurring if that person is dead or suffer the way they've suffered, then you don't have a situation that's readily resolvable. The other thing we look for is we look for grievance accumulators. We look at people who don't have the capacity to let things go. So a good factor that we look for, because we don't only look for bad elements, we look at mitigators. A good mitigator is someone who has a capacity for forgiveness. Sometimes the very question of what would it take for you to forgive, to let go of this grievance, becomes very important. And here's where we're talking about teams and the employees, and we have a number of people who've joined us today from HR. Here's where background history, how people have responded to supervision, whether or not they've let go of grievances, what opportunities have they had for remediation or to address problems. That becomes very important, and HR is often very central to what we're doing.
Also very central to some of the other facts that we might be looking for. And Vern, if you can comment on the types of things we're looking for, the facts that we get from HR in employee profiles and all of those databases of information that we have that can inform this process. Vern, any thoughts?
Yes, most of the time when we work, it's very important to bring the right people from your organization, and that is HR, that is inside counsel, and certain managers that are involved with the actual threat. We're looking for family records, we're looking for history of workplace issues such as just person-on-person threats. We're looking for people not showing up to work, why they didn't show up. We're looking for those things that nobody's looking for. Are they providing any leakage for us that's giving us a clue into what their grievances is? So I think it's really important that they understand that this is not just bringing us in. We have to work in conjunction with their team, with the right players.
Yeah, really important. A lot of the times we look for information from our clients. We look for information from those who know the people who are lodging the threats, if they're known. All types of information can be derived from an employee profile. And Vern, you hit on a really important one. Did somebody stop showing up for work unexpectedly? Have they been late 2 or 3 times over the last couple of weeks? We look for these trends. We look for these escalations or de-escalations. We look for things that can help inform how this person might be thinking, what their motivations might be. And we're looking for, in addition to that, the stabilizing and destabilizing factors in their lives that Dr. Lipson alluded to earlier. This is a very, comprehensive process. We're trying to, at the very base level, we're trying to predict or assess whether somebody's going to commit violence based on threats that they have lodged. And that's a very complicated process. And we use all information that's available to us. We try to paint these pictures of escalations or de-escalations. If somebody's got stabilizing factors in their lives, that might be, they just bought a new house, they just had a child, they were just promoted or got a raise. Those things that might keep somebody within the right and left limits of society and the law. When we look at de-escalating factors, is this somebody who recently encountered financial difficulty? Is it somebody whose spouse left them or they had a death in the family, a serious sickness? Maybe they're sick themselves. And there's no silver bullet to these types of investigations and assessments, but these are the types of information sets that we're looking for so that we can help understand somebody we've never met. Dr. Lipson, can you comment particularly on stabilizing, destabilizing, the kind of whole of person approach and the information that we're looking for?
Yes, definitely. So there's a lot of behavioral observations that take place, which is personal grooming, how they're showing up to work, tardiness, their ability to concentrate, how they're working with team members. Because we know there are relationships between social isolation, loneliness. We have this from the FBI and the Secret Service that often people have suffered 3.6 is the average. This is from the FBI mass shooter study 2018. Is they've suffered 2017. They've suffered 3.6 losses in their lives. And so we look at those sorts of losses, and it sort of matches what we have with adverse childhood experiences research. So are those present? Because we know there's a link between someone being suicidal and then later on wanting to hurt the people who they believe made them feel this way. So that's where the mental health component comes in, and awareness of losses, who in the workplace knows what someone's been going through. And we then look at anniversaries, are court dates coming up? Are there certain things that we know could be triggers?
And how does a known mental health condition or diagnosis or drug or alcohol abuse, I mean, these are all compounding factors. How does that play into to an assessment, to an investigation? And I know those are two totally separate topics, but know that from working many of these cases, they can really heavily impact the approach that we take.
Yeah, so here's where we get some of the beautiful complexity and why we have lawyers and others involved with us, because there's American Disabilities Act and there's different accommodations we have to make. What is it? What triggered it? How severe is it? Is it paranoia? Substance abuse we worry about. And speaking about COVID, we're dealing with a lot of people who are dealing with a lot of stress factors. We're dealing with people who are potentially losing jobs. We're also noticing in San Diego County alone, we've had a threefold increase in fentanyl deaths. This is happening nationwide. The use of methamphetamines. A lot of people at home are drinking more to deal with the stress and uncertainty. There's less sleep. These are things that lead people who already are fragile potentially to crack further and put them at a risk either to harm themselves or harm others. So we try to keep track of these things and see what's present and what's going on in the workplace. And that's where we need to get the information to notice whether or not there's been a change and whether or not that change portends potential problems.
Vern, what are you seeing when you encounter, these threat cases where, there's a perception, there's a belief that there may be some mental health issues afoot, or there may be some substance abuse afoot, particularly around the types of teams that you will build to deal with those types of threats? What are your thoughts when those present?
It truly is I think Kroll and its contractors and its vendors, I think this is what we do really well, is as we approach a threat and we begin to understand who the threat is and what is going on in their life, what kind of either drugs that are not taking or they are taking. Those are the kind of pointers that kind of direct us to what we need to bring in. Once you bring in Dr. Lipson and he's able to kind of match what we're looking at as a threat physically, he's able to identify the issues they're either dealing with psychologically or through drugs or not taking drugs.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to highlight, particularly when we talk about mental illness, is the perception versus reality. And going back to that underlying grievance, and I welcome both of your thoughts, is from my experience, it's been more important to keep in mind not only the whole of person approach, that anybody who's threatening us or our people are people themselves with, like I said, motivations and stressors and influences in their lives, but also that their perception of reality is more important than an independent third party looking on. So if they believe they've been damaged, if they believe that they've been affronted, if they believe that they've been harmed in any way, that's more important to understand. And that helps inform the threat management process, I think, stronger than anything. And if anybody, takes anything away from this webinar, it's exactly that the person lodging the threats against us and our organizations, what they believe to be reality is really critically important.
And if I may, sometimes it's not readily apparent until halfway through the case where we're finding out that sometimes the client themselves have mental illness, and we don't necessarily see it until halfway through the case, and we're readjusting our safety approach of not protecting that person, but to try to help them or get help themselves.
Yeah, so talking about perception versus reality, mental illness doesn't equate with violence. It's a low base rate in people who are mentally ill. So the perception sometimes is if someone's mentally ill, they're more likely to be violent. They also have to be angry. There's any number of things that we have to look at that's related to what's the impact on mental illness on their actions. One of the things we're looking at more recently, and is a recognition of something we called overvalued ideas. These are not delusional, but they're ideas that people believe in that motivate behavior. And here's the impact of some of the derisiveness that gets fostered through social media. They end up believing certain things that make them feel important, make them feel they're involved, make them feel they're changing the world. And these overvalued ideas can promote actions, and that has nothing to do with mental illness. So we have to sort out what's actually going on with someone and recognize that there are all these intersecting components, including the environment they're in, how they resolve problems, their past training, whether in the military, whether or not they've had a head injury, other different things that we have to know if they're present, which could influence someone's capacities, their abilities, and also their ability to regulate their own behaviors.
Dr. Lipson, I'm so glad you highlighted that, because mental illness absolutely does not directly correlate to violence, and I'm so happy you pointed that out. In the vast majority of threat management cases that we work on, particularly when workplace violence is the concern, you know, there's not mental illness afoot. There's anger, there's frustration, there's aggregated over time these grievances that aren't properly addressed, and particularly now when people are under tremendous stress, like you highlighted with COVID. You know, folks are under tremendous stress, and it's manifesting, you know, in ways that previously we haven't seen. And there's been a significant uptick as a result of that stress that everybody's under. So I'm really, really happy that you highlighted that, and that's an important thing, an important takeaway. So let's talk about some of the boundary probing activities that we should be looking out for. When somebody lodges a threat, it's important to understand why they're lodging the threat, what their underlying grievance is, understand who they are as a person, and gather as much information as possible. But we also have to monitor that individual. We can't take the threat as one moment in time. We have to understand what they've done since they've lodged that threat. Do they continue to threaten? Are they coming to the workplace? Are they calling? Are they leaving emails, voice messages, text messages? Do they continue to contact in a threatening way, or is this a one-off? Is this an isolated incident? So really important to understand some red flag indicators of violence, but also the boundary probing activities that somebody might be engaging in. Vern, do you want to talk about some of those boundary probes and what you've seen and how those can manifest?
Well, I think, you know, this isn't a cookie cutter approach. I think we have to look at each industry differently. You know, if it's a threat against a church versus a corporation that's dealing with either left wing or right wing radicals, those are, you know, we're looking at what their message is as a group or an individual. Do they have a grievance with the company or just the idea of the corporation? So I think those are what I'm looking at when I'm starting to look at the boundary probing of people or groups to start with.
And let me jump in. Threat is a process. So we're looking at what are the steps in this process. So boundary probing means people are looking for signs of weakness. They're looking for what they could get away with. Maybe they're taking photographs. Maybe they're checking doors. If it's an outside threat, they may be checking the perimeters, what your security is. All those types of things happen with boundary probing. And we need to look at this in terms of what's going on with this process. What is someone thinking? And here's an opportunity for us. The opportunity is if someone believes, I'm going to do this, they're going to respond this way, then I'm going to do this. There's an escalation set of steps that they see where they're going to arrive at that landing where they want to accomplish what they want to accomplish. When you intervene in a way where you say, hey, maybe you have some legitimate complaints and you're coming from the outside, you may then start with a dialogue that then provides different options other than the only one they were perceiving. So when you have perseveration, which is the next word, that's only seeing one outcome and one fixation. We're trying to provide many different outcomes, not only for the person who people are concerned about, but sometimes for the organization, to appreciate there's different ways potentially to respond to this where things aren't going to have the outcome that everyone's anticipating.
And I think you also have to kind of look into, when you're looking at this, they're not only testing your security program, but they're also testing law enforcement. They're also testing who else is going to come and support you in the time of need.
Yeah, great points. And Dr. Lipson, if I can amplify one of the things that you highlighted, and that's, you know, the multiple outcomes. We want to present multiple outcomes. You know, one of the goals of threat management, like I said, is to stop the threat actor from lodging threats. It's not winning a courtroom victory. It's not any type of articulable trophy win. It's not seeking monetary damages. Those are all things that we can deal with after the fact and through counsel and through outside counsel and through security. Those are all things that are on the table. Those are options. But really our goal here is to provide alternative outcomes to violence. Help understand why the person might be acting in the way that they are and how we might be able to provide those alternative outcomes. So I'm really glad you brought that up and you highlighted that. So let's talk about the intervention and mitigation options. And Carson, if we can advance the slide. Really our goal here is to be as well informed as possible. And we talked about the human resources being a great resource for information. One of the things that we're also going to do when we get introduced to one of these cases is interview people who may know the person who's lodging the threats, understand what their life has been like for the last couple of days, weeks, months, years. There's a treasure trove of information available out there in people that we might talk to. Oftentimes we have concerned family who might be of assistance. Oftentimes we have clergy, we have other members of society who, through our investigation, we identify somebody has been involved with or has a relationship with. And those are people that we might talk with to get better insight and understanding as to who these people are and what might, quote unquote, make them tick. So we want to be as well informed as possible. We never jump into a threat management case or managing any type of threat without having as much information as possible. And Dr. Lipson and Vern, maybe I speak for you in saying this. I know certainly for me, I never have the answers to all of the questions I want to ask, but we try to be as well informed as possible. The investigator in me always wants more information, but we get to the point where we have to start making an assessment based on what we know, and we try to be as inclusive as possible. Any thoughts there?
Well, we do try to point out the information we need in order to make the assessment, in order to have understanding to provide to everyone. And that information may often be in web presence, it may be in family court records, it could be any number of places. And we begin to ask questions which lead to more questions. So often we're asking questions more frequently than providing answers, with the goal of motivating ourselves to a better understanding.
And I think as a security, you have to be flexible with that. You have information right now, you make an assessment and you are your target to that point. And then as you get more information, you become a little bit, you have to be flexible and be able to.
Hey, Vern, you cut off, at least for me, in terms of audio. Did the same thing happen with you, Matt?
It did, yeah.
No, your voice has gotten really small.
So I'll highlight the third bullet on the slide there, the physical security considerations. One of the goals of being so informed is to develop a plan. What are we going to do with this information? Once we assess the threat, once we have an understanding of, or we've narrowed our options of what to do next. In any intervention or mitigation strategy, we have to be hypersensitive to the notion that we might escalate things by taking action. We always seek to de-escalate, always. We always seek ways of providing alternative outcomes like Dr. Lipson alluded to, but we can't control how that individual is going to act. We can make informed decisions, but what we have to be sensitive to is if based on our actions, the situation escalates or that is used as a friction point and the person decides to act out. We need to be considerate of that. We need to understand that. We need to understand how that might manifest. And if our clients, if the recipients of those threats are vulnerable, all of those things, the physical security considerations, the protection of them and their family, the protection of the workplace and everybody's physical security has to be addressed before we make any overt steps, before we do anything that could seek to escalate or could escalate things. Again, we're seeking de-escalation, but we have to be prepared for the alternative. Vern, do we have your audio back?
I hope so.
Better than before, still a little quiet. Speak up and we got you.
I think the physical security considerations, we just have to make sure we take away the targets of opportunity and you harden it with realistic security. And we all work with clients that there is no such thing as unlimited budgets. So you work within a realistic budget and you provide a customized level of protection for that threat.
Excellent points. So Carson, do we have any questions that have come in from the audience? And again, please, if you have any questions, you'll see on the GoToWebinar banner the ability to send in chat messages. I urge you to do that if you have any questions about the material. Again, our goal here is to provide material so that you can manage and deal with some of these threat cases yourself, and also to understand what types of specialties are out there that can help. Carson, do we have any questions that have come in?
Hi, Matt. Yes, there are a few questions in the queue. The first one being, what do we counsel frontline employees to do when they perceive a threat for the first time before the professional team can be brought in?
So I'll take that initially. So that goes back to the education and sensitizing our employees to the notion of threat management. You know, if our employees, if our staff don't understand that a threat may manifest, that it may be presented, the expectation that they do the right thing in the moment is unrealistic. We have to tell our people that if you receive a threat, no matter where it comes from, if you perceive that somebody's threatening violence, here's where to report it, that you identify a central point of contact or a team. I know we train threat management teams all of the time, and that's bringing a group of professionals from within an organization around a table, giving them the insight from people like Dr. Lipson and Vern on how to deal with these cases. But for the frontline employee that might be fielding some of these threats, the important thing is, what do I do next? You know, what information should I gather? If I've got them on the telephone, how do I extend that telephone call and gather information? If it's simply something that I saw on social media or received in email, what's important for my threat management team to see? And then how do I get it to that right team? How do I get it to the people who are trained to deal with it? That to me is the most critical element of frontline employees. Vern, Dr. Lipson?
Well, let's take some cases that you and I have worked together, Matt. The biggest piece that we're missing is the collection of evidence in the beginning and the lack of knowledge of how to do that. So when we arrive, we actually have clean evidence to view. About 50% of the time, it's either destroyed or just erased off of a wall or something before we even get there. And we're dealing with the phantom of the people, what they remembered a week ago. So I think request training and education for your managers and your people of what to do when you receive a threat and how do you collect the evidence and preserve it for us and law enforcement.
Yeah, I'm going to take it a little differently, and that is we always look at the immediacy and the nature of the threat, whether or not we have to contact someone immediately to come in. So sometimes you don't worry, someone is in the workplace, they have a gun, they say they're going to do something. That's an immediate threat. You don't necessarily wait to hire contractors or go in-house. I mean, there's things that you respond relatively quickly to. But what's really important in an organization is not only potentially do you have drills where you prepared in terms of how you will handle things, you know, run, hide, fight, you know, whatever model you're going to use. When in doubt, get out, which Vern uses a lot. So there's different ways to approach things, but people need to believe that, number one, you're not going to over-respond. Over-respond means someone may have blurted something out, having a horrible day, and say something. Everyone could go to hell. I wish everyone here was dead and I never saw them again. You have to determine, basically, you don't want to over-respond where someone comes forward later on, they perceive that's just someone blowing off, but now that person's been arrested. Or you don't want to under-respond where organizations feel no one takes anything seriously. How many times have we seen something written on a wall or spray painted, and how many times was it just cleaned up and no one did anything? No one here takes threats seriously. So you have to create a culture where threats are taken seriously. You look at the immediacy, and people feel you're going to respond proportionately in a manner that's going to work for everyone.
It's important for managers to follow up with the employees that they get the threats from, so the employee does see that the company is taking it seriously.
Yeah, we see a lot of, you know, again, going back to the frontline employee and training and education, we see a lot of time and effort and resources dedicated to all types of training, and all very valid. Part of the active shooter training I know that we do includes threat management. It includes, the pathway to violence. What are the red flag indicators of potential violence? So before it ever gets to that active shooter situation, the most violent culminating incident potentially associated with threats, how do we deal with that as a community? How do we deal with that as a society and as a workplace of concerned people? I firmly believe that given the right information, our employees, our citizenry, our society is likely to do the right thing. They want to report these types of things. If they perceive a threat and they feel threatened and they're fearful, like Dr. Lipson mentioned, they want to tell somebody. We've been conditioned to see something, say something. Well, if I see something, who do I say it to? And I think that's critical, that an organization identify that central point of contact for people to go to, and that there's confidence in that process. They know that that person or that team has the proper training to deal with it. Carson, anything else coming in on the line?
Yep, we have several questions coming in. The next question: with COVID and more employees working from home, how does a company or threat management team keep tabs on those people who may have shown attempts or signs of risk in the past?
Okay, I'll start and then I'll let others jump in. So one of the things that we've been doing, I've been doing with public entities, is working with people who are mandated reporters. That's physicians, attorneys, any number of professions, when you're dealing now with virtual meetings with clients. So what we teach people is the same thing that we've been doing in security for many, many years, which is, what are the things to pay attention to? So if we would notice someone is not doing well at work and deteriorating, we use a fancy word, decompensation. If they're decompensating, we could see online if someone's not bathing. We look at fingernails, we look at grooming. We could see someone's not doing well. In addition, we could see some of the signs that someone's deteriorating in terms of holes in the wall, maybe there's anger problems, broken furniture. We could also look for signs of drugs or paraphernalia. You shouldn't be seeing that with an employee who you're paying to work with you, to see empty bottles, shooting up rigs, all those other smoking pipes, whatever you're looking for. So we begin to pay attention to other things we see when we're brought into someone's home to suggest that maybe this employee is having a hard time. And we don't jump to conclusions because we don't know who's in the household. We don't know who it belongs to. We don't know how things happen. But it raises the sort of questions we might want to begin asking that come from a place of concern and support, where maybe potentially we have an EAP, Employee Assistance Program, where virtual counseling is available. Maybe someone needs to talk to someone and get some coping skills, because interpersonal violence has been increasing. Any number of problems have been made worse with all this pressure and not being able to get away as often to work. And in addition, most people aren't used to having their kids around them the whole time. And that could be stressful in terms of how it affects your ability to work. So we have to be aware of all these factors.
Yeah, some other things that we're going to look at, Carson, to address that. The frequency that we're seeing threats, the timing. Sometimes, for instance, if voicemails are being left let's make an example, an executive is being threatened by a former employee who is terminated. This is something that we see pretty regularly and routinely. What time of day are these threats being lodged? Is it 2 o'clock in the morning? Do our threat actors sound like they're under the influence? Is it once a day? Is it once a week? And then it turns to 5 times a day or 6 times a day? If it goes from a 2 o'clock in the morning voicemail to now 1 o'clock in the afternoon, again, we're looking for changes in behavior. We're looking for changes in frequency, but also changes in severity. Have we gone from vague threats to something more pointed, more acute, more actionable? Dr. Lipson gave the example before of someone storming out of a room saying, I wish everybody was dead. I wish I never saw you again. Everybody's entitled to a bad day. Is that then followed up with something more specific, more precise? All things to consider when we're assessing and investigating these cases.
Yeah, we use the terminology applied or direct threat. Are they implying? And then we look to see whether or not there's escalation. And obsession, we see that in stalking cases, and that is, can someone not let something go? Is this one event responsible for everything? Has it destroyed their lives? And with more and more people losing work and difficulties finding other pursuits, people tend to hang on to their grievances longer because they don't have anything more wonderful to move on to.
All right, Matt, the next question, do the same principles apply with reputational threats, which can have significant implications?
You know, that's an interesting question. I would say yes. You know, threats to reputation, again, what we're talking about here are threats that are emanating from people. And these people are motivated to threaten you or your organization or your reputation for one reason or the other. There's an underlying grievance or series of grievances that they're working through. So the process, to me, is very much the same. The influencing factors, whether it be mental health, whether it be drugs, alcohol, whether it be stabilizing and destabilizing factors, the red flag indicators of violence, all of that all might be different for a threat to reputational harm, but the underlying individual lodging the threat is a human being. They have those motivations, they have those fears, those anxieties. So I think understanding that the person that's threatening you is a person themselves and addressing it in that way, I think the process can be very much the same. Dr. Lipson, Vern, do you have any thoughts?
I think on the reputational side, we have to, again, bring in the multidisciplinary approach and be prepared for critical messaging when they attack your corporation. We're in a stage in our country where there's a lot of people that just don't like large corporations, and they're going to do what they can to stop it or destroy some sort of reputation. And those are the things right now that I think is going to increase as the year ends with, we're hearing about a lot of layoffs and things like that. So we have to be prepared of how a corporation as a whole, and that means security and messaging and PR all play into one portfolio, and don't address one without the other.
Yeah, so here's some of the complexities that we get involved with, and Vern and I have had to deal with this with A-level celebrities, and that is, if you attack someone, your name becomes associated with them, especially in the media, and that gives you some of the star of that shine, some of their light. Now your name gets associated with them. We get particularly concerned where there are some people who want that association to be forever, and the way to do that is with a homicide suicide. And that is, if they kill that person, their name will be in the newspaper and they'll forever be associated with them, like names like John Lennon, etc., where we could see there is that type of twinning or combination. This is my way to be the person who's associated with them forever. I love them. This happens in the psychotic type attachments, and now I will be the only one they're forever with. So we're looking at very complex factors that go along. Then we also have to look at their sensitivity now to sexual misconduct allegations, which have been in the news, which are easy to, which people feel more open coming out with after Me Too. And since Me Too, we have concerns with what's called systemic racism. And these often will fuel attacks and the like. And you know, it's very important to know how to respond to those. And that's part of sometimes of what we end up doing, because we're not looking to escalate things or have that person associated constantly in news pieces down the road as they engage in the devaluing of the individual or the brand.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. The next question, in communicating with employees, customers, etc., how do you balance the need to provide information versus the need to keep information restricted to avoid compromising security?
So I think Dr. Lipson really touched on this before, and maybe we can expand upon it. You know, the key is to not over or underreact, and every situation is different. And you know, you want to make sure that those who are reporting perceived threats understand the process, understand that it's being followed up on, understand that there's a team that's now responsible for investigating and assessing and doing all the things we've been talking about. But there's also a balance in not spreading fear, spreading unnecessary anxieties. And every organization is different. The openness of every organization is different. The way they communicate with employees. So it's a very careful and delicate balance that we need to strike. It's very difficult to say, that can apply to everybody, but on a case-by-case basis, that's one of the things that we talk about is how are we going to inform our employees, particularly if they're in danger. We cannot keep information to ourselves, but to what level do we bring folks in? To me, that's critical. Dr. Lipson, do you have anything here?
Yes, I mean, here's where public relations come in and within the organization, and that is you want to be careful in terms of what you share, but you also want to share the reason that you can't necessarily reveal information. For example, you could say there's an investigation going underway and it's important for us not to share all that information at this time. When it's appropriate, you will hear more of the details. And often that could be related to what law enforcement requires. Let me give you an example. In a sexual assault case, law enforcement may want someone to make a cold call where they call up, law enforcement's on the phone and they say, why did you do that last night at the party? I don't understand. You said you cared about me, and they're getting information. You don't want to indicate that there are going to be cold calls taking place where someone's going to call up and try to get information from law enforcement. Law enforcement's going to try to get information potentially to prosecute. So we have to be very careful because we're not looking for the despoliation or the destruction of evidence. And so we have to be careful in terms of what we reveal when, but people need to feel you're handling it. And you need to address issues. So I sometimes will find myself speaking to groups of employees where the very nature of the people doing the investigation reassures people. New material may come forward, and people will ask questions sometimes about their possession of firearms and other types of things that you could address how you're considering those, in terms of what you're doing. So you're working with this on an organizational level.
I think timing is crucial when you approach the threat itself, because sometimes you may escalate the threat. And as Matt said at the beginning, we're not here to escalate the threat, we're here to de-escalate it. So if you act too soon and you have a law enforcement go make contact with the threat, it could escalate it to a point we don't want it to be at. So when do we bring in law enforcement? When does an attorney write a cease and desist letter? So the timing has to be coordinated very carefully.
Right, and the timing also is involved with there's certain things you want to document to get restraining orders, and whether it's corporate, whether it's individual. Sometimes you work with target hardening of the executive of the persons who are threatened in terms of their homes, changing routines, how they drive. There's where they drive, when they leave. So there's all these elements taking place, and you could see why you need a team, because it's too much for any one person to handle.
All right, gentlemen, and then has gender violence risen during COVID-19 quarantine? Domestic violence should be considered at corporate threat assessment.
Well, what we know is interpersonal violence has risen. We've had various, most district attorneys' offices now will have postings related to the increases in it. There are organizations that have suggested having safe words that someone can let a friend know that something like that's going on. And what's the reason? You have someone who is involved in the power and control issues in interpersonal violence, and now they're with the person the whole time. And lower self-esteem related to many of the things happening with COVID, your ability to earn an income, your ability to get out in the world, the things that we feel good about, the ability to work out, the ability to get together with friends. A lot of those things are now different. And if they happen with much more tension, concerning what's going on and potentially what if you get ill. So we do know that there's been an increase. So we are predicting in terms of threat assessment that there's going to be more suicide, there's going to be more depression as this goes on. And those are going to be some of the long-term consequences, the divorces and the marriages that did not survive this additional stress.
Thank you, Dr. Lipson. And since we're reaching our time, I have one final question. Some executives may not consider threat management as an important thing to invest in. How does an employee of that company or a company like Kroll educate the executives on the importance of a threat management team?
Wow, that's a complicated question. Can we extend our time by an hour? So, look, in a nutshell, for me, threat management and a robust threat management process doesn't take a tremendous amount of capital investment by a company. Really what it is paying attention to their employees, paying attention to the threat environment they may already be in, and providing their employees with the tools to report it to people who are properly trained to deal with it. Even the most robust or rudimentary threat management programs, the byproduct is taking better care of people. At the end of the day, it's hard sometimes to justify security programs when we're looking at the bottom line, but really a good threat management program utilizes resources that are organic to your organization, trains people to be better at recognizing threats of violence and what to do in the immediate onset, and then really recognizing when you need additional help. So really, the complicated question, how do we convince executives, for additional funding and threat management? But, at the end of the day, it's really just companies and entities and organizations being more concerned about their people and giving them the tools they need to be safer.
Yeah, and we have help in this.
I'm sorry, Doc, go ahead.
I was saying we have help in this. There is counsel that sometimes will talk to some of these executives. There are insurance providers that will sometimes talk, or brokers that will suggest things, because they're dealing with issues of liability coming from that end. And then there are OSHA guidelines and other things that exist that suggest that there should be certain plans, and depending on your state, other issues that come up. And it's a process of step taking that someone needs to know that this is not so overwhelming, because even thinking about threats for some people is overwhelming, even if you're an executive. Executives have more things on their table than they could ever want to handle. They don't want to have another one. So if they see this as a win-win, that's the way of getting them engaged.
And I think executives and boards look for one thing: return on investment. So if you could show them the cost of reacting to an event as it happens, and we're always in a reactionary mode, and the cost of scaling up incredibly high to handle a certain issue, and then scaling down when the issue's done, and then go up and down and up and down. If you could show them by being in a proactive stance and having a holistic and comprehensive security program as threat management as a piece of that program, that's going to show them that we now have this capability without having to spend a tremendous amount of additional money, and finding the right person to run that program for them.
Excellent question.
It is.
All right. Thank you, Matt, Vern, and Dr. Lipson. That ends our session. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We hope you found the information informative.